Now, there's been widespread criticism of how the African National Congress appears to be struggling to implement its own resolution on the step-aside rule for members and leaders that have been charged with various acts of wrongdoing. And this follows, among others, the recent conviction of the ANC Women's League President Bathabile Dlamini, as well as the recent election of Mandla Msibi to the Mpumalanga ANC provincial executive. Now, while Msibi has since stepped aside, it remains unclear whether Bathabile Dlamini's fate will follow suit. In another development, former eThekwini Mayor Zandile Gumede has also been nominated for a leadership role in the party's regional structures, and this despite facing corruption charges. A political commentator, Oliver Dickson, joins us now to share his perspective on some of these matters. Oliver, good to see you again. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina. Thank you for having me.
Oliver, what would you say is the difficulty with the step-aside resolution and its implementation for the African National Congress?
The difficulty is not the rules, Sakina. The difficulty lies in the stubbornness of the people it is meant to govern. But Bathabile should have long stepped aside, right? And and that was at the time she was facing perjury charges. The grey area comes in now, the fact that she's been already convicted and sentenced and paid 100,000 rand in a fine. And the party now asks, what do we do? What if she steps aside? What is she stepping aside for? Because remember, the step aside rule is not an expulsion. Neither is it a suspension, right? It's supposed to be a temporary measure up until you've resolved your integrity and can now be a member of the party again. But Bathabile Dlamini resolved the integrity, so to speak. Justice was served because she was found guilty. She was convicted, sentenced, which was to a fine of 100,000 rand and the rest being suspended. She paid it. And then the question becomes, so now what? This is where the ANC's disciplinary code of conduct and disciplinary constitution has to kick in. And there it says members are only expelled if they found serious of a crime, if they found guilty of a crime and convicted to a sentence other than a fine. And here she was given the option of a fine. That means that that rule clearly doesn't apply to her. And so Bathabile Dlamini should then be a full and active member of the ANC, because it really has, the rule which has that small exception, which says without the option of a fine, doesn't seem to apply in this instance, right? Because she had the option of a fine. So she should have long stepped aside, and that step aside should have been a temporary measure. And now that all is over and said and done with, you can't apply a temporary measure to an issue that's already been resolved. And so I don't see a reason for her to step aside other than a voluntarily expulsion or exclusion from the party on her part. And I don't see that happening either.
You don't see it happening, but of course, from the explanation that you've just given us, Oliver, there seems to be no reason why any sanction should be applied at this stage to Bathabile Dlamini. If it was to be applied, it should have happened while that court case was ongoing.
Absolutely. It's a little too late at this moment. It really should have happened long before conviction and a sentencing happened, right? She should have stepped aside in that instance. And the rule didn't apply there because Bathabile was just too powerful for that rule to apply for the incumbent being Cyril Ramaphosa, who has to appease the ANC Women's League as a voting bloc, right? And now that he's unsure about that support bloc altogether, there's really no reason for Bathabile Dlamini to be protected any further. I think we will be naive if we don't call the step-aside rule for what it truly is. It's not a rule to restore the integrity of the party. The integrity of the party of the ANC is long gone. There's absolutely nothing at this stage that can reasonably repair it, right? What that rule was meant to do was disable Cyril Ramaphosa's political opponents within the party from reasonably being able to compete against him.
So, Oliver, just looking at what's happening at the moment with the ANC, of course, trying to get as many of these regional and provincial conferences underway before the policy conference and, of course, then the elective conference at the end of the year. So, again, we saw this in KwaZulu-Natal with the leadership in that province coming out saying basically they don't know what to do as one way of reading what was said there, because you have the nomination by people at branch level of people who are facing serious charges. And then it seems as though there hasn't been any clear instruction from the mother body in this regard, and we saw that replicated in other provinces as well. Most recently in Mpumalanga, where Mandla Msibi, who's facing very serious charges of murder, he was elected again to the top structure of the province, and he stepped aside, as we understand. But should he even have been up for nomination? So again, what is the confusion with this step-aside rule?
Sakina, I'm very, very convinced that the court will overturn, if not the entire conference that happened in Mpumalanga, at least the nomination and election of Mandla Msibi. Here's why. The step-aside rule is very clear, that you cannot participate in any ANC activities up until your issue has been resolved, right? And participation can range from anything to being at a rally to participating in the elective process, right? For you to be elected, you need to be nominated and you need to accept that nomination, right? Mandla Msibi either didn't accept the nomination or he did. In the instance that he did accept the nomination, he was an active participant. That even if they called him at his house, they'd be like, hey, Chief, you've been nominated here. Do you accept the nomination? If he answers yes or no, that is an active participation. That phone call, at least then, should never have happened in that instance, right? And if that accepting of the nomination doesn't happen, then it is not a fair elective process, right? Especially if there were, and unfortunately, I don't know in this case of Mandla Msibi, if there were other people contesting for that very same position. If it were the case, then that would have been an unfair elective process on their part. In the instance where that phone call didn't happen, and this guy was elected, and seconded, and there was a seconding of his nomination and an election thereof without his acceptance thereof, that too is not fair electoral process. And so in the instance of Mandla Msibi, the ANC is in trouble on procedure and not on integrity of what do we do with Mandla Msibi who's facing murder charges, right? On the issue of facing murder charges, that's a very serious allegation. And you cannot reasonably say we're in a process of uniting the party and fixing the party and fixing the erosion of the integrity that's taken place in the party. And that means that we're not going to have participating in our elective conferences and elect people whose integrity is in disrepute at the moment, right? And so in that instance, you can clearly see that the step-aside rule was not really a rule to be able to fix the integrity of the party. And once again, Mandla Msibi forms part of a bloc, forms part of a faction that is favorable to the CR22 faction, right? And that needs to be taken into consideration as well, that factional politics will dictate how and when these rules are applied.
So we know that this weekend the eThekwini conference is set to kick off, and looking at that, the name of the former mayor of eThekwini, Zandile Gumede, has come up again. We know again she is also facing serious charges of fraud and corruption. But of course, given what has happened in Mpumalanga and your explanation about active participation in the elections and how this opens the ANC up to legal scrutiny, what's going to happen here? Because when you talk about someone actually being nominated, let's say, as you put it, you being nominated by someone at the branch level, how does the election go ahead unless you accept it? Because you have to accept or decline that nomination.
Again, the foundation of how this is implemented, Sakina, is incredibly factionalized, right? And to that extent, I don't think anyone's going to stop reasonably try to stop Zandile Gumede's nomination and election and participation unless that happens at provincial and branch level in KZN itself. And if it does happen at that level and goes to court, then Mandla Msibi has a lot to worry about, because Zandile Gumede's judgment in that instance can be precedent setting, and that means that it has to be applied to Mpumalanga as well. But I don't think the CR faction is going to necessarily push back at Zandile Gumede, because KZN is not a province they reasonably calculated into their margins in terms of we need KZN to win. They never calculated it because they never believe that they can reasonably win over that province, right? Mpumalanga, they certainly need it because Mpumalanga was, in the last election, as you would recall, the determining factor as to who becomes president. It was at the 11th hour where Didi Mabuza started singing songs of renewal, when all along, hours before, he was singing songs of unity, right? Which was non-aligning. And so Mpumalanga then became the kingmaker in that instance. Mpumalanga still remains the kingmaker if Ramaphosa believes that he can retain all the provinces that had previously voted for him in the last elective conference. With the addition of Mpumalanga, he's in the clear to win. KZN, they reasonably never calculated. And so to keep at bay, the ambiguity of this rule, to keep at bay the pushback for Mandla Msibi and that faction in Mpumalanga, because if you push back at Mandla Msibi, you're tearing apart that entire focus faction, right? Because you might have to face the possibility of a rerunning of that conference, and the focus faction cannot afford to go and lose at this stage, given that they form part of a bigger national picture as to who becomes president. Given that piece of fact, I think what you will see in KZN is that election going ahead unabated, and you won't see that level of pushback unless it happens at a branch and a provincial level against competitors of Bathabile Dlamini, against competitors of Zandile Gumede, who are not necessarily aligned to Ramaphosa's faction, but may have been aligned to other factions. Didi Mabuza's back in the fold, right? It might be a faction aligned to him. He reasonably believes that he can win over KZN. But again, Sagina, this has got nothing to do with the actual application of the rules. This is about what best works for the factional politics.
So some people may be asking, because you can imagine the confusion caused within the African National Congress itself around the step-aside resolution. People are looking now at the state capture report, and they're saying, well, if you look at the people who've been mentioned there, the fact that they may be serious, political contenders in the African National Congress, what is to happen there? And perhaps, again, just on a point of clarity, Oliver, explain how the step-aside resolution does or does not come into play with regard to the revelations of the State Capture Commission.
In the instance of the State Capture Commission, the step-aside rule does not yet find applicability, Sakina. The step-aside rule speaks in the first instance that there must be a charge by the NPA and that there must be a case number of sorts. There's no such thing. If you're not facing a charge, there's nothing to speak about. The State Capture Report, which the fourth installment is yet to come out, and as the Commission told us yesterday, don't call us, we will call you. There's no charges emanating from that just yet, directly from the report, just yet. Not to say that there aren't people in the report facing charges, but they're facing charges at the accord of the NPA, not at the accord of the Commission and the report of the Commission, right? And so the fact that Gwede Mandashe, for instance, is implicated in the report is not something significant to what plays out going forward, because there is no charge. The report may implicate and finger some people, but it is yet up to the president whether or not there will be any action coming from that report, assuming, of course, Sakina, that the report doesn't face 10-step review process all the way from the High Court to the Constitutional Court and whatever lies in between.
And then if we look at how serious the African National Congress actually is and why this step-aside rule came into play, why that resolution was taken at the 54th Congress of the ANC, you have people who then are asked to step aside or resign from their positions, but then you find them serving still, for example, as MPLs or members of the National Assembly. How does that work, and what does it say about the seriousness of all of this for the ANC?
It's indicative that the ANC is not serious about cleaning itself up, right? And it is profound what Mama Action said several years back, right? And you'll recall that quote which came to define the ANC. We all have small anyana skeletons. Sorry, Bathabile Dlamini actually said that. And that, I think, therein lies the answer for us, Sakina, is that if they were serious about the application of this rule, there would be no ANC to speak of. And this is why the application of this rule will be so selective and inconsistent. It is specifically to be able to avoid the fact that there will be no party left to speak of. If we're clearly going to fix issues at the level of integrity and not be so technical, right? And say, well, at the level of a charge, if the NPA, and it must be a serious charge, can't be a charge that we reasonably think will be absolved with a fine. There's all these things, right? And what's interesting is that the step aside rule has rendered the ANC's Integrity Commission, useless, because it is like, well, the Integrity Commission can no longer make discretionary decisions because there's this piece of document that says who and when, comrades must be stepping aside. And in the instance that the Integrity Commission cannot then reasonably summon any MPL or any MP in front of it and say, please explain yourself, means that that this document has superseded any sort of function that the Integrity Commission can do. So they'll never truly restore the integrity of the ANC. And this document was never going to be a panacea to the ANC's integrity problems. The ANC's integrity ship has long sailed. The rot is so far deeply seeped into the crevices of the party that it is unreasonable to expect that the step aside will inconsistently apply will be able to fix the party. Again, what governs who and when this rule applies to, Sakina, is incredibly aligned along factional politics.
Well, thank you so much for your comments this morning. Oliver Dickson, a political commentator, discussing the ANC's application of its 2017 resolution, or the step-aside rule, whether the party will effectively utilize this resolution as its list of implicated officials grows and the broader implications thereof.